First thing I need to say is Sebastian doesn't know these questions, okay? So it's straight up. But I just wanted to start by thanking you all for coming out. For many of us, the first event of the season, although I know we had a patrons event the other night. But it feels like the beginning of something and an exciting season, so thank you for being here and sharing it. And thank you all for believing in the MFA and being the supporters that you are. I have to say that this is a special night for me because I think he's great. And I think we're very lucky to have him in Boston, and it's a privilege for me. And I have to say, I actually had an experience that you didn't have, which is I got to walk around for half an hour through the galleries with him just before this, and there's nothing better. I just want to say that. So Sebastian said, isn't this great? We're going to have a conversation, and I get to ask you questions. And I said, no, that's not actually how it's going to work, okay? I'm going to ask you questions, and we'll see where it goes. And what I have a few questions about Sebastian himself, about some assumptions in the book, about some of the artists specifically, and then Sebastian's chosen a few images at the end that he just wants to talk about, and talk about how he looks at things and whatnot. So let me just read his biography. I asked for the one, okay, in case you run into his children, it's longer than one paragraph, but I'm going to read one paragraph, okay, just so you, for those of you who might not know. Sebastian Smee has been the Boston Globe's art critic since 2008. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2011, having been a runner-up in 2008. He joined the Globe's staff from Sydney, where he had worked as national art critic for The Australian. Prior to that, he lived for 4 years in the United Kingdom, where he wrote for the Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, the art newspaper, The Independent, Prospect magazine, and The Spectator. And it says here in parentheses, he couldn't keep a job. He has contributed to 5 books on Lucian Freud. His book, The Art of Rivalry, 4 Friendships, Betrayals, and Breakthroughs in Modern Art, which we're going to speak about tonight, was released in the middle of August. So welcome, Sebastian.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a little bit about you.
Okay.
Then about the book, and then about some artists.
Fantastic. And by the way, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you all so much for coming. It's really great to see so many people here tonight. Thank you. Go ahead. Hit me.
So I'm interested in where the urge to write comes from, like your family life, mentors, how you decided you actually wanted to do this for a living.
Yeah, I mean, I loved writing, when I was young. It's a sort of platitude to say that, but I was very attracted by books and writing. I'm from a family of linguists. My father is a classicist. My mother, who is Swedish, was head of modern languages at a school in Australia, and my sister is a brilliant translator from French to English. And I'm sort of the runt of the litter in a way, because I don't have any other language, certainly not fluently. I studied a bit of several languages, but really can't conduct a conversation in any of them. So, I guess I focused on English and began writing seriously, I guess just out of school. But I remember, like many people, feeling that sort of sense of reward you get, even at school, when something is published or praised by a teacher. The funny thing is I finished college and I was working in a video store, and I wrote a piece on Quentin Tarantino, whose films were just out and being talked about a lot at that time. I knew nothing about film, nothing really about Tarantino either. I sent it off. It was really long and just terrible. And I sent it off to an editor of a magazine who got back to me, he explains, for the sole reason that he thought it was amusing that I also worked in a video store, just like Quentin Tarantino had. And he sort of cut my piece, by 2/3 and published it. And I was, in a sense, off and running from that point. It was such a kind of drug in a way to get published. It's so exciting. It's such a silly kind of ego trip in a way. But when you're young, it encourages you to go on. So I feel forever grateful to him. And then I had studied art, so when I realized that I was completely faking it, writing about film, I thought I'd fake it around art instead.
And we're glad you did. So tell us a little bit about the move to America. So why? What was it that made you want to take your writing career, which was starting to really take off, and bring it to the United States?
Well, I mean, I just feel incredibly fortunate that I've ended up here. It was an amazing thing when I look back on it, that it even happened. From my point of view, I guess it happened because my wife Jo's here tonight, we had lived in London for 4 years, and then we had a baby on the way. And because we were both freelancers, she's a violinist, a concert violinist, and was playing in orchestras in Dublin and Belfast and London. But we were both freelance, and so with the baby on the way, we weighed our options and decided, partly because we were both offered jobs back in Australia, to go back and have what turned out to be our son in Australia with family and so on around. But in a way, because things had just been beginning to work out for us in England, it felt like a bit of a retreat in some ways. And I think we said to each other that if something else came up, we were still adventurous types, and we would take the opportunity. And I saw this job advertised, the job of art critic at the Boston Globe advertised. And I've never before and never since seen the job of art critic at a newspaper advertised. So I applied, and I didn't get it. It went to Ken Johnson, who was at the Times. I didn't hear anything from the Globe except that they'd received my application. But about a year later, I'd completely forgotten it, I got a call from a man called Scott Heller, who was the arts editor at the Globe. And he said, "Are you still interested?" Because Ken had decided to move back to New York. And I said, "Sure." And then they flew me over. I stayed with dear friends who were the only people in Boston that I knew. They're here tonight, Tony and Elsa Hill. And they were so supportive and encouraging. And things seemed to go okay at the Globe. I returned to Australia. Jo and I talked about it, and we decided, after I was offered the job, to take it. And then we called Tony and Elsa and we said, "Is it okay if we stay with you for a while?" We had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old at that point, and they...
Are you still with them? Or just come on and on? Is that why they're here?
We finally found a place, but it took a while. So thank you, Tony and Elsa, so much. And we just... we feel so grateful, honestly. I mean, people were so kind to us from the beginning. And it's just been such a privilege to work at the Globe and to have places like the MFA and, of course, all the other great museums in this region as my beat. That's in a sense what it is. I'm a journalist working for paper, and the museums, the great, great museums of New England are my beat. And I love it. I love it so much.
So one of the things that I think you do so very well is you look with care. And your writing, it seems to me, starts with the act of looking. I'm not saying that you don't reflect and that you don't weave it together in a way that's engaging, but there is an element in your writing that's about the act of looking. Where does that come from?
I don't have any special methodology or anything like that. I'm just like everyone, I think, in the sense that, when something grabs me, it grabs me. It's one of those things, isn't it? A lot of people seem to feel intimidated at times by art, different kinds of art, perhaps contemporary art, perhaps old masters, perhaps Asian art, and I feel the same way. Often I have to go and review a show that I don't know anything about that, and I often joke, like an art critic friend of mine said, there's nothing I know that I didn't learn on deadline, and it sometimes feels like that. But knowing is great and valuable, and it deepens your experience of things. But it's also great, as you say, just to look. It's a visual medium most of the time, after all. And sometimes it's acoustic, and other times it's cerebral, deliberately. But it's mostly a visual medium. And there was one experience that, the question makes me think of one experience I had back in Sydney when I was a student at Sydney University. I had a wonderful professor there called Virginia Spate, who had written, at the time, and perhaps still, certainly one of the great books on Monet, Claude Monet, called Colour and I forget, it's called Colour of Time or something, Colour of Time, I think. Anyway, she was amazing, and she took her small class to the Art Gallery in South Wales, which is a lively museum, but doesn't have all that many great works, certainly not compared to the MFA. And she stood the class, 5 or 6 of us, in front of a painting by Bert Morisot, and we stood in front of it for 40 minutes. And she, even though she knew everything about the picture, and everything about Bert Morisot and everything else, said almost nothing the entire time. What I do remember, though, is that she asked just once in a while, she asked these very basic questions. She said, "So what colour do you think she put down first?" And we were left to think about this. And so on, one question like that after very basic, simple questions. And in a way it relates to how I often think of think of things as a journalist. That idea of the art of the dumb question. It's actually,
how am I doing so far?
Badly. No, but I mean, it's often the case that you feel, and I've felt this so many times myself. That you need, when you're interviewing a famous artist or something like that, you need to ask a lot of really smart questions and show off your intelligence and that you've done your research and all that. It's often much more effective to ask a short, sharp, dumb question and leave a gap, That's what, at the time, I remember Virginia Speight doing, and it didn't matter what our answers were. The exercise was really all about looking, and it helps to have silence when you're looking as well. So that's an experience I really remember.
So I had a great experience with Sebastian because we did walk through the galleries before, and we were in the big Coat Gallery, which is the salon-style European with the incredible silver. And he just looked up at the Rubens painting, the long, and he said, "Look at the dog, the way it just isn't quite stable, and it's just like Lucian Freud." I mean, those are pretty.
I think I said Francis Bacon, but yeah. Well, I'll tell you why. I probably did say Lucian Freud. I meant Francis Bacon. that would be typical of me, actually. Yeah. But some of you might know the picture. It's quite high. It's a very big one. But there is a dog in the bottom right corner, and it's blurry. And I think that's what made me think of Bacon's sort of blurred images sometimes. And it seems to be, as you say, sort of not stable at all and coming out of the picture. But yeah.
Anyway, it was a real privilege. So I want to go to the book for a moment. Okay, so many of you might have read it, or at least you know a little bit about it. It's about 4 relationships, so 8 artists, and their complicated love, hate, connection, separation, and what ends up being the ebb and flow of a relationship, and for what reason. And it's pretty deep. You say some pretty deep things about the notion of relationships, which it might be a little worrisome to say it with your wife here, but I want to know about, you argue a bit that what attracts us in a relationship can, in the end, repel us. That something that brings you close together, that something in that attraction becomes a thing that pushes you away because something happens in the middle. So 2 questions. A, do I have it right?
Yeah.
And B, give an example from one of the relationships where there was that attraction and that connection, and then boom, there was a rupture.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and it's the pattern that I observed in all 4 of these relationships, and was fascinated by and attracted to, and it seesawed a little bit. It wasn't just necessarily a movement from one to the next, and then the push away. It came in and out quite a lot, and I think what does happen in between. I mean, it's to do with instability. I think you used that word before, and I think that's it's really apt, because I think what I was interested in is the movement that happens when you, in a sense, fall under the spell of someone. And I think when you're a creative person and that happens, I think something powerful and fascinating and incredibly fertile, incredibly generative can happen. In each of these cases, I mean, let's one example might be when we think of Edouard Manet and Edgar Degas. So Degas, this incredibly talented draftsman, very serious, very dedicated in an almost sort of monastic way to his art. but kind of stuck. You know, his family were despairing of whether he'd ever get to finish what he was working on, and whether he'd ever show and ever have any success, because he was the kind of personality who, as I think I write, sort of cultivated difficulty. De Kooning was a bit the same. Lucian Freud was a bit the same as well. And then he meets Degas meets Edouard Manet, who is making these extraordinary breakthroughs and painting in a way that's brisk, seems brisk anyway, has a lot of painterly sort of flourish. He's not such a gifted draftsman, but it doesn't seem to matter. And he's engaging, it's not all just formal, it's not all just happening on the picture. He's engaging with life and cosmopolitan Paris around him in a way that Degas it's foreign to him at that moment. And he falls under his spell, and he's influenced by him both on the canvas and by what he sees of him in his personal life. And so he shakes things up in what he's doing. And this, again, is a pattern that happens in all four of the relationships. And then, there's this feeling, isn't there, of, okay, I've changed and I'm under the spell to some degree, and yet I'm really not that kind of person who falls under people's spell. I'm strong, I'm incredibly good, I know that I'm good, whatever it is, whatever people say to themselves. And I can't be anyone's protege. I can't, that's not me. And so there is a movement then. If you are ambitious and have some kind of originality and that creative spark in you, I think it then becomes about hurrying on, in a sense, and forming your own identity, your own creative identity. And so that becomes very complicated. It becomes complicated both for that person, for Degas in that case, but also for Manet, who's sort of having to handle this strange relationship that was probably very flattering at first. But then he realizes that, no, this guy's actually unbelievable. He can draw like no one had ever seen. He's kind of, obsessive and monomaniacal in a way that I'm just not. And he seems to see through me in a way that's very disturbing. I'm improvising and projecting so much here, and I hope I haven't sounded so crude in the book. But that kind of dynamic goes on, I think, a lot. And it's funny, I'm reading these belatedly. I'm sure many of you finished them long ago, but these Elena Ferrante books, which my sister and wife have, urged me to read, they're extraordinary. And these two characters, who are the lead characters in those books, in so many ways kind of represent this dynamic. And it really is sort of in and out. They come together, they push apart, and this sense of them doing great things together is there, which I think is there in all these relationships. But also of that threat of the loss of identity, of losing yourself, and yet when you're together, you're actually more capable of doing great things, and there's an intensity and a sort of significance that is missing when you're apart from that person in your life. And I've just been fascinated to see how well Ferrante articulates that dynamic, because it's very much what I was trying to get at. It's fun. Anyway.
I want to read a sentence that you wrote, which is a very beautiful sentence. It's what you're saying here. When you fall under the spell of someone, there is often a dual movement within you. Even as you succumb to the other person's powerful influence, you feel an equal and opposite impulse to bolster your own identity, to fortify yourself.
Right.
And then you link that to the idea that these four pairs are all artists of modernism.
Right.
Right? And you take this idea of bolstering your own identity and saying that, I'm paraphrasing, the thing about the modern artist is that she, in this case he, looks for solitude and looks for individuality because they want to be original,
right,
but they also want to belong. And that you talk about that tension of solitude and belonging.
Right. Thank you for putting that so well.
He put it very well. I've just got my Cole's notes. Okay, it's just
But that is really what fascinated me, and I wondered what it was about the modern era that seemed to create these rivalries that weren't this old cliche of enemies kind of slugging it out, but they had this intimate dimension to them, and there was a kind of falling in love to some degree, a different degree in each relationship, but some degree of falling in love that went on at the same time. And I thought, when you think of what's going on before the modern era, there are so many original artists, but in a way you gained a reputation and you gained success by, in a sense, mastering and then extending a tradition. And so there were criteria, there were objective, observable criteria that people agreed upon. And you might shake things up a little bit, but you were still painting whatever it was, Madonnas or Greek myths or whatever. Something different happens, doesn't it, in the modern era, where a huge amount of prestige is suddenly attached to originality, at least among avant-garde artists. The public was slower to sort of, come on board with this idea. But what happens, I think, when you put such value on originality is that these objective criteria evaporate. And in a sense, you are on your own. There is this tremendous solitude that I think all of these artists felt, and many other modern artists. This sense of, I'm out on my own here. I'm really out to sea rather than sort of hugging the shore, if you like. And
well, the word you use, which is a beautiful poetic word, is unmoored. You say the artist becomes unmoored.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think it's those maritime analogies may sort of work. I don't know, but it's I think what happens then when you are on your own in that sense is that and speaking as a critic, I'm ashamed to say this, but it's perfectly true. The critics are no good. They're way behind, right? The collectors and the museums are also usually lagging way behind. It becomes fellow artists who feel along the same lines as you, who value originality and something more than originality. They share a similar kind of fascination that is really unorthodox with you. They're the ones who can give you that sense of affirmation that you are somehow on the right track. And I think Manet found that in Degas. He was lucky to find someone who was so talented and so smart, who realized that even though the crowd was sort of baying for blood virtually, I mean, they just thought what Manet was doing was preposterous, as they did with Matisse, as they did with Pollock later. But he was this person who was going, no, this is good, and not only this is good, but I'm going to try and be a bit more like you, and that must have been very powerfully affirming. But again, as we talked about before, I think then there's that pushback and this very complicated and volatile sort of movement that happens.
So I want to use two words and wonder whether you would agree that in a way these two words are at the center of the relationships that you evoke. One is the word risk. I think you even say it at a certain point, that what one artist did for the other was release them into an idea of risk. It certainly was true, I think, with Bacon doing that for Freud and loosening him up. Yeah. So talk about risk and how you think about risk, the artist taking risks, a relationship encouraging risk.
Right. Well, it's true, and I think that, when you look at Freud, for instance, Freud and Bacon are perhaps the less well-known artists here in an American context, but Freud in his early days was making these incredibly tight, fastidious drawings, which he seemed to have hunched over for hours and hours, days, weeks, months, and he really had. And he meets Bacon, and Bacon is being celebrated as this extraordinary young artist who's doing amazing things and taking incredible risks, as you say, and actually was a gambler as well, and on canvas would do things like take a rag and smear the face of a portrait or another part of the body, and he would destroy more than half of his paintings, and spoke, I think above all, spoke very articulately about risk. He said things like, when anything ever does work in my case, it only ever works when consciously I don't know what I'm doing. And that's something that de Kooning and Pollock talked very eloquently about as well. Freud was enormously impressed by both that language of Bacon's, that sort of rhetoric that he had, talking about risk and so on, and also by what he saw of Bacon on the canvas, and resolved over time, it didn't happen immediately, but resolved over time to stop drawing altogether, which was extraordinary in a sense because drawing was the one thing that he gained what reputation he did have from. You know, people like Kenneth Clark and a whole bunch of very influential English collectors were celebrating him for this, but he wasn't terribly well known beyond those circles, except as the grandson of Sigmund Freud. But he said, right, enough with drawing, and gradually over time, he started using thicker and thicker brushes, sort of until he was using hog's hair brushes and thicker paint, you know, lead white, and you know, all these you know, things that made his style of painting inherently risky, stroke by stroke. But of course, he didn't go fully in the direction of Bacon, and this is again this sort of point of pushing back and finding your own voice, where Bacon really believed in painting from photographs, and certainly not from, you know, the person sitting in front of him. Freud really stuck to that idea of painting from life, and
because he thought he could see differently.
He did, you know, and it's funny. I mean, he had a feeling, and Matisse had a similar feeling, that you, by being in the same room as the thing you're painting, you can really pick up on the emanations of that person. That's a loose word, and I'm not sure he ever even exactly used that word, but you know, he talked about how if you look closely enough, you can see the way the air moves around people. And obviously you can get to know them. I mean, in his maturity, Freud was painting people over months and years, spending every day with them for long stretches of time. Whereas Bacon, you know, as I say, would work from these. I mean, he painted lots of pictures of Lucian Freud, but none of them ever involved Freud being in the room. In fact, he would use photographs of Freud, which he would leave lying around in the studio and step on them, and they would be crumpled. And he did that deliberately, and it was a feeling that he had that only by being at one remove from the sitter could he practice what he called the violence on them that he felt was necessary to bring out the truth of who they were, what he called the brutality of fact. He had this marvelous rhetoric around this kind of thing, and was very persuasive. And you know, he said much more brilliant things than I can repeat now. But I think Freud was very much under the spell of all that, but realized, no, I have to do my own thing. And it wasn't just that he had to kick. I mean, it was inherent in him, in a sense, to want to do that. But it was a real fight, I think, within him.
So that actually is my second word, violence.
Violence,
okay?
Right.
Because you start with the idea of Manet cutting Degas' painting. You end with Jackson Pollock killing himself, essentially, in a car. And then you have the riff on de Kooning and destroying the body and taking it apart. So...
What is that about? Yeah.
What's it, is it a common theme in all four stories, do you think?
In a way, I felt that it was. And, yeah, look, I mean, all 8 of these artists, pretty much, maybe Matisse was an exception, but, you know, they were pretty unpleasant people in many aspects of their lives. You know, they were. Well, I think I would have liked them a lot as well, but Manet especially. Charm and kind of like, but they all seem to have an interest in something like violence, in terms of the access violence can give you to some kind of truth. I mean, I'm speaking about it so abstractly, but it was really interesting to me, and to go back to those Ferrante books, there's an extraordinary scene where there's an image of one of the characters, the brilliant character Leela, which, you know, her family or husband wants to use as an advertisement in the shop front, and she's against it, but she says finally she agrees to it, but first she and her friend Elena, they're the 2 main characters, have to practice this violence on this image, and they cut it up, they slice it, they cover it with masking tape, they make a collage of it, And I was really going, oh my goodness, this is in a sense exactly what's going on in some, at least some of these chapters. This sense of the erasure of your own identity. And that's, we're speaking on a metaphorical level, I guess, but there is, when you fall under the spell of someone, a temptation to want to erase your own identity because their personality is so powerful. And in each of these cases, I think we are talking about very powerful personalities, very sort of, in a sense, intoxicating people. Matisse, people spoke about him as being incredibly good at capturing people's attention and almost winning them over in a sense. And so I've lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Can you bring that back to a notion of violence or aggression or maybe confrontation?
Yeah. Well,
how does the moment of confrontation happen?
Right. I think I was just going to say that then the violence can often be the thing that goes the other way, that you need to push back. And so with Manet, this mystery that I wanted to write about in the chapter on Manet and Degas is, why did Manet take a knife to this portrait, a double portrait that his friend Edgar Degas had made?
And do we know that it was
Manet
who actually cut the painting?
We only know from Vollard, who's talking about it 20 years later, the dealer Ambroise Vollard, there's my terrible French accent, and Julie Manet, who was Bert Morisot's daughter. So we can't be 100% sure because they talk about it a lot later. It could have been, for instance, Suzanne, Manet's wife. But they both took it for granted that it was Manet himself. And their reason, the reason they gave, which had some authority for a long time, was that Manet hadn't liked the way Degas made her look. And so he wanted to cut through it and somehow change the way she looked. I suspect it was more complicated than that. And I don't think we'll ever have a definitive answer. But I do know that at that time, if you trace what happened between them through the 60s there, Manet was having a tougher and tougher time. He was just battered by the press. He'd fallen into something of a depression. His whole production had slowed to a trickle. He was having terrible troubles with pictures like The Execution of Maximilian, which we have the first, you have the first version here in MFA. and other things. Things weren't going too well. And Degas, on the other hand, is on the up and up. And there were many other psychological dynamics. I think Degas was looking very closely at Manet's rather unusual marriage, and Degas made it very clear that he didn't believe in marriage. He didn't believe that it was compatible even to be an artist and married at the same time. And of course, these ideas were, tragically not unusual in 19th century France. But there was this feeling, I think Manet had, that Degas was just getting too close. He had a very analytical and at times disturbing sort of eye or gaze, and things built up. There was the complication of Bert Morisot having entered the scenario as well, and Manet and she seemed to be in love, but Degas was in the picture and sort of somehow flirting with the Morisots, terrific painters. So it was a very complicated situation, and I think Manet was just somehow furious. The volatile situation, and he'd had enough, and he took a knife. But we won't know, and I don't even state what I've just said quite so explicitly, I don't think, in the chapter, but I think it was all these things coming to a head.
So you write about 8 artists,
right? And
you knew one.
Right.
So I want to talk a bit about that and maybe start with the question, why did Lucian Freud... So I don't know how many you know, but Sebastian has written quite a bit on Lucian Freud and knew him and spent time with him and actually went to the Velázquez exhibition at the National Gallery with him and all that. But why did he trust you? Because there is an element of trust that he would have opened himself to you. So just share with us a little bit about how you think that evolved.
Happened. Yeah, right. Well, I was lucky to get to know him. I was living in London. We'd just arrived there. I happened to know that a colleague at my paper in Sydney, the Sydney Morning Herald, had told me that a friend of his was a friend of Lucian Freud's, and he thought I might like to know that Freud had liked a review that I'd written of a show of etchings of his that came to Australia. So I just sort of filed that information away, but then living in London about a year later, I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to see if I can get in touch with him? The National Gallery in Australia had just bought a big painting of Freud's, which I don't particularly like, to be honest, but it was a big deal in Australia, a bit reminiscent of when the National Gallery there bought Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles, which sort of subsequently went on to almost bring down the Australian government. It was so scandalous. But I'm getting sidetracked. But so I got in touch with Freud through his lawyer, in fact. I found out how to do it through the National Gallery director. And he was lovely to respond and invited me and my wife to lunch. Then a few days later, he invited me to his studio to look at some recent things that he'd finished, including a big picture of his son, one of his sons. And it became, I spent time with him, I guess, every 3 or 4 weeks over the course of the next 3 or 4 years. And it was, I mean, he was, again, an extraordinary personality in many ways.
Okay, so I want you to talk about how you saw him.
Right.
But why do you think he trusted you?
Oh, okay, sorry. I don't know. I was... it's very difficult to speak to that. I mean, I was a 20-something young art critic. Maybe he liked the fact that a younger person was interested in his work. I think that sometimes happens, doesn't it, when older creative people feel that, oh, it's fine, I've got my peers who like my work, but it's nice to know that younger people also... I don't know. It's very hard to say. I mean, I felt, as I think almost anyone who met him felt, there were many people who were burned by him, unquestionably.
You weren't?
No, I wasn't. And I felt very much enthralled to him for a while. I was glad to be a critic and to sort of be able to keep my critical distance from him in a sense. But, was taken out to lunch and dinner many times, and of course, as a young critic, it felt an enormous privilege to sort of be invited back to his studio to see pictures and to sit and talk at sort of 1 a.m. I mean, no one had his phone number, so you had to wait for him to call, and calls would come at 1 a.m. or sort of, or just 9, would you come to dinner, and then you go back to the studio, and he didn't really drink, but he would have an incredibly lovely bottle of wine, sort of open with a bowl of walnuts or whatever. And he lived just down the road from a wonderful small restaurant, Sally Clark's restaurant in Notting Hill in London. And I would eat there with him all the time. And so, of course, how can you not sort of feel, oh my goodness, this is extraordinary. But
so tell us something you learned from him.
Well, I learned that he was very single-minded, and the flip side of that is he was very selfish. I mean, he was completely forthright about that.
Okay, that's what you learned about him.
Yeah.
But what did you learn about art, about life?
Right.
What value did he communicate to you?
Well, maybe that to be a successful artist, and it's tough news to hear, perhaps, for many of us, but that you do have to often be very, very focused, and that can mean very selfish. And we'll all have different moral feelings about that. But he was unbelievably industrious. He worked 365 days a year, usually painting from at least 2 people, and often at the same time, a still life or a picture of his garden, every day. And he was just completely obsessed with his work, and that's impressive. I mean, that kind of dedication is impressive, and I think that each of the artists I write about in the book had a similar kind of dedication. I know many artists who, have very different ways of working, and I admire that tremendously. But often that is what it takes, and I felt that he understood that for him that's what it took.
So give us a moment when you were either in his studio or at an exhibition where you were standing in front of a work of art and where he said something, or you had an exchange, or that something happened in relation to a work of art. How would you describe the way he spoke about that, if you had those? You know, that brush stroke or that gesture. Did you have moments where he looked at a painting with you and...
He never said anything sort of pretentious, you know, that sounded arty, if you like, you know. And we would talk more often about books, about what we were reading. By the way, an incredibly intelligent person, this sort of almost wild intelligence that you never knew what he was going to say or what he was going to do. Yeah, I was telling you before, as we were walking through the galleries and looking at that wonderful Velázquez here, there are several, but the Louis Góngora, the small portrait, I remembered walking through this Velázquez exhibition at the National Gallery. He was allowed to go to the National Gallery pretty much whenever he liked, at any time of the day or night. They let him in.
Because I think there are a few British artists that they allowed. Right?
Yes,
like,
that's right. That's right.
I think Bacon was even one of them. But
yes,
yeah.
and contemporary artists too, which I think is a wonderful thing. But the funny thing is, I was in that Velázquez exhibition very self-conscious myself, and you know, felt like I probably ought to try and say something intelligent, and maybe gave one or two passes at that and gave up, and we just walked through in silence. But what I remember is going out afterwards and being in Trafalgar Square, and there was a man there, and I said this to Matthew a little earlier, so forgive me for repeating myself, but a man there who was just covered in pigeons, absolutely covered in pigeons, because he had seeds, and they just covered every part of his body. And it was kind of extraordinary, but you know, the sort of thing that many of us might sort of just walk on and leave. I remember Lucian standing there for a good 5, maybe 10 minutes, just staring at this man. And I sort of stood a few feet away and just waited. But he had this beady-eyed, intense focus on things when he looked at them, and I just sort of laughed at that. But you know, he really did. He was rather shy in many ways, and people don't understand that because he has such a sort of a reputation for colourful behaviour, to use a euphemism. But he did have a shyness, and when he would open the door to his house, you know, he would sort of look sideways and down and let you in. And then, I mean, you talked about artworks. I mean, he had a few things in his house, and there are times where I just remember him. He had a great Rodin Balzac sculpture, and beneath it, the dog basket and his pet whippet. And I would often go in because I'd often be nervous in the early days, especially, and I'd sort of, you know, pat the whippet and have this huge sort of naked Balzac looming above me. And other times, you know, he had one of those Degas sculptures that is the only sort of one that has two figures. It's a woman being sort of washed by a maid. And he would just be talking, telling some hilarious anecdote, and his hands would just be sort of holding this thing and perhaps stroking some part of it. Not at all sort of lewdly, nothing like that, just touching it, feeling it. And that stuck out in my mind as well.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we look at a few paintings? And
sure,
why don't
let's
share with us how you look at paintings?
Yeah, so these are all pictures in the MFA, and I didn't realize for a few years actually that the MFA owned this Freud, which is just a picture of his daughter, and like many of his pictures, it's not particularly, you know, attractive. There's a tremendous sort of ordinariness in his pictures, which can feel very English, can't it? Sort of, you know, I always think of Philip Larkin and Mr. Bleeny. Christmas at his sister's house in Stoke is my favourite line, I think. Just this sort of sense of, oh, here is England, here are the English, the sallow skin and so on. But the funny thing is, Freud has a reputation for making people ugly. I don't really think that he saw it that way, and I've learned not to see. I don't think I actually saw it that way from the beginning myself. I was just incredibly affected by how truthful, how visceral and how real it felt, and an incredible tenderness within that, which surprises some people who think that no, all he's doing is expressing his distaste for people. I really don't. Knowing him and even before I knew him, the feeling I got from his work was not that at all. It was more about this. Someone said, Ortega y Gasset, the poet, said, love is a phenomenon of attention. And I often think of that with Freud. There is this aspect or this quality of attentiveness or attention sustained over long periods in his work that is what I find so powerful. Here is another one. Here's the great Degas. Many of you will know one of several great Degas in the MFA collection. And it came in the last sort of 15 years, didn't it? I think I've got that about right. And you do feel here, don't you, this sense of an instability in the way it's constructed. And this incredible look in the Duchess's face. It's Degas' Italian family, and they're in mourning, and there she is with this, I don't know, it's hard to say always, isn't it, but a fatigued, intelligent, knowing, and perhaps skeptical look I find in her eyes. But it's that feeling of blur and instability that I think really attracted people like Bacon, who loved Degas, and Freud.
It's the notion also of these figures inhabiting the same space but being very separate, which is also what you sort of talk about in the relationship, right? That there is this connection and yet a desire to separate at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's right. It's an amazing picture, isn't it? Here's the wonderful Manet. I'm looking at here on the screen, of course, but yeah, it's great to see it on that scale. What do you make of this picture? Do you love it?
Nice try. You know the way he slips it in right at the end and just tries to...
Oh, please, I've talked so much.
No, this is truly one of our truly great paintings.
And it's wonderful that we have two pictures of the same model, who was herself a painter, Victorine Meurent. This is the big one, of course. And then there's the small portrait, which feels very truthful and honest to her, doesn't it? Like, I think, his pictures of Bert Morisot. Whereas this, like so many of his other sort of celebrated pictures of the 1860s, is a bit of a dress-up picture, right? I mean, he's posed her like this. He's given her the guitar. She's got the bag of cherries. It's all a big fraud, in a way that I think Matisse's pictures were. The Nice pictures from about, in the 20s, 1917 to about 29. There's Matisse in his hotel rooms in Nice, and he's got a big dress-up box just out of the picture, and here, try this on, try that on. And there's a sense of conspiracy, I think, between the sitters and the artist. And I feel that so strongly with this picture and the other pictures, like Olympia and The Luncheon on the Grass.
Yeah, the only thing I would say in response is... so what, in a way? What I mean by that is, this is the projection of his imagined life, and he's made something quite remarkable about the notion of the everyday figure being celebrated as a sort of royal, with a royal aura, and so he brings the street, the sense of celebration to the street, and then, maybe I could be as cynical as you, but I'm not going to, in the following sense. Like that painting is made up of caresses.
Right.
And I like that, this
The
body
touch,
made
the
out
touch
of
is
just
incredible.
the sort of...
Yeah.
And so in a way, the notion of the made-up piece starts to disappear for me.
No, well, I agree totally with what you say. I didn't mean to be cynical or sound negative. To me, it's a positive value. There's a tremendous playfulness and almost sense of mischief in Manet's great pictures from the 1860s. And I think that's important to remember, because it's a big difference with him and Degas, who really was about kind of dissecting what he saw before him, almost in a scientific and fairly ruthless fashion. And that's why he's celebrated as this great realist. Manet is often talked about as a realist, but in fact I think, like his friend Baudelaire the poet, there is this sense of play and of celebrating the furtive, secret, hidden sides of people, the unknowable aspects of people. And again, I think, that's a theme that I try to sort of touch on through the whole book, that, these artists were very modern in part because they were responding to, they were trying to bring into play what they felt was actually unknowable and unknown about life and about people. De Kooning talks about content as a glimpse, these slipping glimpses he keeps talking about. Pollock too, I think, is sort of veiling imagery, these drips. Almost people talk about them as writing in the air, but the result, even if it is that, isn't legible, is it? It's like a veil that he's creating. So this constant sense of things that are unknowable, and I think Manet really was in touch with that.
Why don't you show us one more image?
All right, here we go. Well, I tell you what. Since we just had three, why don't we finish with this sergeant, which
You're gonna get sentimental on us.
Yeah,
I can tell.
Can I? Is that okay? Because I love this picture because there's so many great sergeants here, of course. But I was asked to pick out some of the pictures I've written about as one of my columns in the Globe that we call Frame by Frame. But I wrote about this a long time ago. But it's a picture of the Cirque d'Hiver in Paris, and it has personal sort of feeling for me because. When we were living in London, my wife and I, we had a little spell in Paris, and we went there because my wife got a job playing in the Cirque d'Hiver, the winter circus. And here it is in this picture by Sargent. It was a magical sort of time. Hard work for Joe, I should say, really hard work, often 2 gigs a day, but I love to sort of see that picture. It has a real sort of meaning for us, and that's the thing. We've lived here now 8 years, and now so many of the pictures in this museum have great personal meaning and connection for me, and for my kids, as well. It's great to take them here, and we always have to see the Copley shark, always, and there are so many others now. So it's a real privilege to live here, so close to this museum. Thank you.
So I think we're going to finish up, and I just want to end by saying, for me, this is like, I don't know, I had a great time. So, to hear somebody who lives in art and who thinks about art and translates the act of looking to the act of thinking and back and forth, and is prepared to actually also engage with issues of motivation and issues of why do artists do something. It's just a great privilege, and I'm going to say it again, we're very lucky to have you. And
thank you for having me, honestly.
Keep going.
Appreciate it.
Anyway, thank you, everybody.